Okay, well, it is 3:32, so I will get us started. We'll probably have a few more people coming in. So welcome to our Fair Housing Conversations Beyond Homelessness, Challenges and How Public Libraries Can Be Part of the Solution. Mouthful, but we thought about it long and hard what we should call this, because when folks think about fair housing in libraries particularly, homelessness is something that comes to mind, and this is a little bit more broad than that. My name is Jeanette Schaefer. I'm the Assistant State Librarian for Library Advancement, and we're so glad you could join us today for this first of two sessions on fair housing. And I have a few of my colleagues here from the Vermont Department of Libraries, and we're proud to present these sessions collaboratively with Jess Hyman from the Champlain Valley Office of Economic Opportunity, CVOEO, and the Vermont Library Association. Individual presenters will introduce themselves as we go through today's program. We're going to talk about the Vermont housing landscape, why this matters to libraries, and also offer some preliminary ideas for fair housing programming. We'll have some more detailed ideas in our February session that Kevin will be talking about as well. So before we jump into that, and while I go over some of our meeting etiquette, I would ask that if you can, please put in your library, if you're in a library right now in the town, so the name of the library, the town, and if you're not in a library, just where you're coming from, and please add a sentence of why this session and topic are of interest to you. That would be really helpful. So we've already gone over the please mute your mic and cameras unless you're asking questions. If you are calling in, you can use *6 to mute and unmute yourself. If you are on the web version of this, you can use the little mic icon at the top on your menu there. Please feel free to post questions throughout the session in the chat. We will give plenty of time in the end to have you ask your questions as well if you're not comfortable putting your questions in the chat, and we'll answer them as we go through, and definitely at the end as well. Note that this webinar is recorded, and because we are a state entity, everything we do here is public record, so your chat and the recording is public record. So with that, welcome again, and I will hand it off to my colleague, Laura Keenan.
Thanks, Jeanette. So welcome, everyone. My name is Laura Keenan. I am the Governance and Management Consultant for the Vermont Department of Libraries. Basically, that means that my job is here to support library directors and trustees in making their library as strong and sustainable as possible for their communities. So I encourage library directors and trustees and staff to email me any questions you have about the work in your libraries. And if I'm not the right person, I will make sure that they get to the right person. So we wanted to start off today's webinar with a quick exploration of how housing issues intersect with library services. Now, while this may be obvious to some people, especially some of you who have decided to join us, you may have some ideas around this. We wanted to articulate why we at the Department of Libraries thought connecting libraries with fair housing issues made sense, at least some of those ways. So as you know, one of the foundational principles of librarianship is reducing barriers to access. And people who are facing housing insecurity or housing discrimination may lack the address that our policies may say is necessary for obtaining a library card. So how can libraries communicate to members of our community who are facing housing insecurity or housing discrimination that they are just as valuable and deserving of access? That their housing insecurity will not prevent them from accessing our services or being seen as part of our community? And how can our policies and practices reflect this? Libraries are also about information, as you know, and libraries often host discussions on challenging community issues, help their communities wrestle with social justice issues, and help educate their communities. So fair housing issues could be another area of discussion for your community. Your community may be ripe for this sort of discussion. Libraries also serve, as you know, as a place of community gathering that is open to all. And access to that is not predicated on home ownership or housing security. We serve the needs of patrons across Maslow's hierarchy of needs, from a place to warm up or a third space to a place of self-actualization and community building. And housing issues also affect how our libraries are funded. We depend on tax revenues, and the fewer people who can afford to live here, the fewer taxpayers we have to support our important work. So for all of these reasons, and probably many more that you can identify, we believe that bringing fair housing issues to libraries makes sense. So thank you for joining us here today for this conversation. We appreciate you being here. So I'm now going to hand it off, now that I've sort of set the scene a little bit, I'm going to hand it off to Jess, who's going to talk about this new partnership.
Thank you so much, Laura. So I'm Jess Hyman with the Champlain Valley Office of Economic Opportunity, and I run the Fair Housing Project. And the Fair Housing Project is one of our statewide housing advocacy programs, together with Vermont Tenants and the Mobile Home Program. And so the Fair Housing Project's work is in line with CVOEO's overall work to address the fundamental issues of social, economic, and racial justice. And our program does a few different things. We do direct education to make sure that everyone understands their fair housing rights and responsibilities for housing providers and service providers and community members. And then we also provide support and referrals for people experiencing discrimination in their housing. And then we partner with a number of organizations and agencies around the state who do enforcement, such as the Human Rights Commission, which you'll hear from Melissa in a little bit, Vermont Legal Aid, and then the U.S. Attorney's Office. And we also take a systemic approach through our Thriving Communities initiative to increase the awareness of inclusive and affordable housing and through work with local housing committees and around the state. And we're really excited about this new partnership with the Department of Libraries. And this partnership came about for a couple different reasons. One, with libraries being such important community hubs and resources for people and sources of information and referrals, it seemed like an obvious connection to increase access to housing-related resources through the library system. And as part of the Fair Housing Project's work, each year we celebrate Fair Housing Month in April. And April marks the anniversary of the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968. And so each year we do a series of events around the state related to Fair Housing Month. And these include workshops, gatherings, art events, and other ways to bring the community together to learn about fair housing issues, and also to celebrate inclusiveness and diversity and all the things that make our communities stronger. And so the partnership with the Vermont Department of Libraries and the Vermont Library Association is going to be a key piece of the Fair Housing Month in April of 2021. This year, our Fair Housing Month activities look very different than in past years. Everything went remote, and we're anticipating that there'll still be an element of that next spring. And so we're really looking forward to working with all of you on some really creative and exciting ways to share information about housing, fair housing, and the importance of inclusive, affordable housing in our communities. I'd like to talk just a little bit about the housing landscape in Vermont. Excuse me. So, we know why we should care about housing, because where we live has such a huge impact on our lives. From the earliest times when we're children, where we live determines what our exposure is to education, to the environment. Research has linked opportunity in housing. Research has made the links between housing and future opportunity as well. As we age, we have where we live affects where we go to work, our access to healthcare, to recreation, what kind of physical and environmental dangers we may be exposed to. And we know that having enough quality, affordable housing is good for our communities, and having diversity in our communities makes for a richer environment for everyone. And not everyone has the same access to housing, as we all know, because of income, historical discrimination and segregation, systemic issues that affect how we can all access housing. And I'm not going to get into the whole history of segregation and discrimination in housing here, but it's a fascinating history that we're still trying to work our way out of. And here in Vermont, we do have a lot of issues related to housing insecurity and housing access. As I'm sure many of you know, there's a lack of availability and affordability of housing in Vermont. There aren't enough homes. There aren't enough places for people to live, and there aren't enough places that are affordable. So half of renters in the state pay more than 30% of their income for housing, and half of those are paying more than 50%. And that's huge. How much money there is to be spent on other needs. Similarly, about half of homeowners pay more than 30% of their income on housing. And there's a recent Vermont Housing Needs Assessment by the Vermont Housing Finance Agency that showed that non-white households are more likely to face housing challenges. And Vermont's homeownership rate among white households is 71%, while Black Vermont households have a rate of just 22%, and this compares to 42% nationally. So we're seeing the effects we're seeing the longer term effects related to race here in Vermont as well on homeownership. Also, Vermont has a disproportionate number of non-white individuals experiencing homelessness. And LGBTQ plus folks, people with disabilities, and those who've experienced violence are also disproportionately affected. And all this challenges with affordability and inclusivity and discrimination, all this was true before COVID. And COVID has really exacerbated a lot of these issues and magnified them. And in a tight housing market like we have here in Vermont, and particularly in our more urban areas in Vermont, a tight housing market where people are priced out and struggling for stability creates an environment where people with the lowest incomes, who are more likely to be in protected classes, have an even tougher time. So there are a lot of challenges related to housing in Vermont, and we do have protections. And so they're both federal and state fair housing law offers protections for many people. So fair housing, which I should have started off by this. So fair housing is the right to equal opportunity in housing, equal opportunity in housing choice, and the right to buy, rent, and live in a home free from discrimination and harassment. And we do have federal and state laws that offer these protections. So under federal law, the people are protected based on their race, color, national origin, religion, family status, sex, and disability. And states have the opportunity to add additional protected classes. And here in Vermont, we've added age, marital status, sexual orientation and gender identity, receipt of public assistance, and being a victim of abuse, sexual assault, and stalking. Vermont also has an additional protected class, which is more related to development and land use, and it's a protection against discriminating, making land use decisions based on the income of the people who would be living in a particular residence. So it's a little bit of a wonky one and something fairly unique to Vermont. But basically it's a NIMBYism protection, which is great. So I think I'd like to pass it over to Melissa now, Melissa Horwitz from the Human Rights Commission, to talk a little bit about how housing discrimination shows up in Vermont. And because one of our goals for Fair Housing Month and for our work in general is to make sure that everyone has access to information about their rights and responsibilities under fair housing law. And I'd like Melissa to share a little bit about what the Human Rights Commission sees in Vermont and what types of information would be best to share with our communities. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jess. And thank you, everyone, for having me. I am an investigative attorney, staff attorney. We go by many names at the Human Rights Commission. And the Human Rights Commission is an enforcement agency. We're a state agency that investigates discrimination. We investigate discrimination in housing, public accommodations, and for state employment. Um, I mostly focus on the housing, and we just got done, hopefully done with writing our annual report. So I have our pretty fresh data for fiscal year 2020, what we saw in Vermont. Um, we had 28 cases that went to formal complaints and were investigated in 2020, and that was up from 21 in 2019. So that's a pretty significant uptick. 20 of those cases were disability discrimination. This is an interesting category because there's two ways that disability discrimination shows up. There's disability discrimination just like race or sex or any of the other protected categories that Jess mentioned, that someone treating someone differently because they have a disability. But there's also, and this is what we see the most of, at least right now, is failure to make a reasonable accommodation or modification. And this is so that people with disabilities can fully enjoy the place they live and be able to live there. So we see a lot of those. And we also saw 5 race complaints, 2 national origin complaints, 2 sex complaints, 3 minor children, 2 for people that receive public assistance, and there was 1 religious discrimination case. And as you can imagine, this is greatly underreported. If you're trying to find housing, like just was talking about just how there's such a great shortage. You don't always, even if you have a feeling that you're being discriminated against, you don't always have the time to go and file a charge and participate in an investigation. So I know I hear offhand in various places that, public assistance is a big category that people are discriminating against, and we're not receiving the complaints. And a lot of housing providers don't realize that you have to accept someone with Section 8. You can't discriminate against where that income is coming from. So I know that's really underrepresented. I don't have the Vermont stats specifically, but nationwide, the complaints for fair housing are 83.75% of the fair housing complaints are based on the rental market. So it's a little easier to detect most times because it's not as complicated as the transactions in real estate. So we definitely, I would guess the percentage we see is even more than that. But real estate also, you can file fair housing complaints if you're discriminated against in real estate. How this shows up in Vermont, like I said, the most frequent thing we see is denying reasonable accommodations or modifications, and specifically is emotional support animals. I assume people are familiar with them. They go by different names: assistance animals, emotional support animals, lots of different names, and they're different than service animals. So service animals can go into public accommodations, whereas an emotional support animal cannot. It's about where you live. There's a lot of frustration there. People, I'm sure you've seen it with the airlines. There's people bringing on peacocks or emotional support peacocks, which actually the airlines are cracking down on now. But a lot of housing providers feel like people are just trying to get around the rules, that they're not pets, and so that they're just claiming it's an emotional support dog or animal. They can be various animals. But the thing with the emotional support animals is that a landlord can request a doctor's note, and the doctor's note only has to contain that this person has a disability and the emotional support animal would somehow alleviate this disability. So they're not entitled to even know what the disability is, or any of the medical records, but they can request this doctor's note. So we see a lot of people being turned down for having, the reasonable accommodation of having an emotional support animal. Minor children, even though we didn't have a ton of cases this year, we just had 3, but that's something that pops up a lot and is very difficult for people to find housing when they have minor children. A lot of times housing providers will think that they're actually, saving the kids by saying, oh, there's a balcony, or this is unsafe, or that's unsafe. And so it's really not an appropriate place for children. That is not necessarily up to the housing provider to decide that. And so it can be really difficult for families to find housing in Vermont. Just more generally, I just wanted to touch on, problems of COVID, related to COVID, nationwide. And we've seen a little bit of this at the HRC this year, but not a ton. But I know nationwide, sexual harassment cases are on the rise during COVID. The Department of Justice officials have warned that housing providers are using the pandemic to harass and exploit tenants who are having trouble paying rent on time and may be facing heightened housing insecurity. So the sexual harassment in housing for these reasons, we've seen before, but now with COVID, where it's hard to move, it's a lot of people are out of work, it's really scary. And landlords, some landlords use that as an excuse that, if you won't provide sexual favors to me, well, you're out, and people feel really stuck and that they have to do that. But that is not legal, and that is something that you can file a complaint about. The other COVID issue that we're seeing more of is increased domestic violence. And I don't know if Jess got too much into this, but that is a new protected class in the state of Vermont. So victims of domestic violence. And that is both protections that you can't discriminate against someone because they're a victim of domestic violence, but they also have additional protections where if someone has been is a survivor of domestic violence, they can request additional safety protections from their landlords, such as getting their locks changed, security systems put in, cameras, and things like that. So that's an important new change to the Vermont law in the last couple of years. COVID's also brought, out more discrimination and harassment against Asian Americans specifically. And what we haven't seen a ton of yet, but I'm sure we will, is discrimination against people with COVID or a history of having COVID. So that's something to be on the lookout. Jess had asked me what information I think is important to get to people. I think if have the opportunity, just making people aware of the Vermont and federal protected classes, because we do have a lot of additional protected classes, and I'm not sure everyone's aware that they may fall under these protections. This is just, one that's dear to me, is that emotional support animals are not pets. And landlord cannot charge a pet deposit. You don't have to, the dog or cat or whoever does not have to have any special documentation or any vests or anything like that. Like I said before, the most that a housing provider can ask for is a letter from a doctor or other professional that knows the individual, saying that they have a disability and this would help alleviate their disability. A few things I thought that could be helpful in terms of forms, and I don't know what librarians, necessarily keep behind the desk, but we had been talking in our meeting before this, with the books and things like that, just informational things that people could have would be if if someone was disabled and wanted to know what they could do so that they could enjoy their housing, just having a generic reasonable accommodation or modification form, which I could provide, I think would be really helpful for people if they find themselves in that situation. And also, a list of protected categories, just as I said, so people would know. So the other source that I just wanted to share is how people can file a complaint with us. So I can put it in the chat, but our website is hrc.vermont.gov. People can file a complaint online. They can call and do an intake. And if you go to our website, people can read reasonable grounds cases where we have found discrimination. You can read the case and see, what the thinking was and what kind of protected categories they were. We also, if anyone is interested, offer trainings on implicit bias and fair housing and public accommodations and a few other things. So if there was ever interest, you can go to our website and read about those trainings there. We also have some COVID-19 resources. I know that Jess has a wonderful list that she had made and will be providing as well. And if you just want to know the fair housing laws, you can use our website, and you should easily be able to find those laws. So I think I will stop there and pass it on to Kevin. And then if anyone has any questions, I'd be glad to answer them at the end.
Thanks so much. I appreciate all that you do. And also thanks to Jess and thanks to Laura as well for that information. I have been working together with this group for about 4 months now, and I think I learn something new every time, usually more than one thing. So my name's Kevin Unrath. I'm the president of the Vermont Library Association, and also I'm the director of the library in Shelburne, the Pearson Library. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing to help partner and help get the word out about fair housing. But I just wanted to say that I personally am very excited that we're talking about this topic, because I believe strongly that libraries are not just places where you come and get books and get other, but we're also increasingly the heart of our community, where people come to talk about issues that are important to our community and to learn about things that they didn't know about before. And I think this topic is clearly very important to Vermonters. So I think the fair housing information that we're getting and some of the programming ideas that we're going to be talking about really could be implemented very successfully in our libraries. So I'm going to ask a couple questions of participants, and I'd love to get some feedback after I finish talking to help us plan some programs that are coming up in February and also in April. So one of those questions is, based on what you've heard today and your thoughts about this topic, what kind of information would be helpful for you to know or to be able to give to your patrons regarding fair housing? And then the other question that I have is, has your library done anything already related to topics on fair housing, writ large topics related to what you've heard? Or listening in on this presentation, is there anything you've thought about that you might want to do in terms of programs or services or ideas at your library? And I'll give you a couple examples of things we've been thinking about here in Shelburne. One is that we're planning to devote a couple sessions of our book club to talking about books related to fair housing. So the grant that CVOEO received for this work included being able to buy some book sets, and they've kindly offered to do that. So we'll be getting copies of a couple award-winning books. One of them is Race for Profit: How Banks in the Real Estate Industry Undermined Black Homeownership. That was a finalist for last year's National Book Award. And then the other is Evicted: Poverty and Profit in the American City. And that actually won the Pulitzer Prize a few years ago. And so there'll be some book sets coming out that the Department of Libraries will be providing. And we're going to mix those two books into our book club over the next year. And that's one, I think, kind of easy way to incorporate this topic into some of the work you do. And then the other thing I wanted to mention was a policy change that we've made. here in Shelburne, we've started offering limited use or temporary cards for folks who don't have a way to show that they are permanently housed, whether they're in some sort of temporary housing situation because they're taking care of sick relatives and they're here, or they're home from school for a limited period of time, or they're experiencing some kind of housing loss. We don't even ask what someone's need is, but if someone says they're not a resident, but they'd like to use the library, we've instituted a policy where we basically take them at their word that they've identified themselves as a library user, and we'll offer them a card that lets them check out a limited amount of materials until they either establish residency or no longer need to use the library. So that's an example of a small policy change that we made a couple of years ago to that we think positively impacts folks in terms of folks who may be experiencing challenges with housing. So those are just a couple examples, but I'd really love to hear either in the discussion that Jeanette's going to lead in a little bit, or in the chat, some ideas you might have, or some things that you might have done that would be good examples that we could potentially share in the future with other libraries around the state. So that's my small part of this great program, and I will pass along now the torch to Jeanette to keep us going.
Yep. Thank you all. Really interesting stuff. And even though we've been working together for kind of a long time already, I learn new things every time we get together about this. So if folks have, we are putting a lot of resources in the chat. So just to let you know that as well. And if you have responses for Kevin or questions specific to the questions that he posited, you are welcome to type them in or raise your hand, or if you're calling in, you can unmute yourself and we will give you some space. So I had asked Kevin whether his temporary card program is also available for migrant farm workers, obviously folks who also don't have a permanent address, but who could benefit from library services as well. Almi says, connect with any local orgs working on the issue in your county, example, Washington County, downstreet.org. Yep. And Leo says, Brooks also has temporary cards. It is harder to support housing when libraries are only doing curbside or have limited patron times, thinking maybe we could post housing resources on our big plate glass window on Main Street. Yeah, and Brooks is in Brattleboro, so somewhat urban, I would say, for Vermont, you know, towns and sizes. So, and Almi, Fair Housing Month is in April. Yep, as Joy has already posted. And let me look at the chat. So if you would like to also chime in with your voice, you're more than welcome to. You can just unmute your mic and talk if you prefer that to chatting. And Melissa and Jess and everybody else are still here to answer all and any of your general questions as well. Jess, you're muted.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. May I jump in for a moment?
Yeah, sure.
I put this in the chat, but I also want to draw people's attention to the Fair Housing Month VT.org website, which shows the activities that happened this past year for Fair Housing Month. And so that included art exhibits and youth writing contests and discussion groups. And so you click on the link in the chat if you'd like to see a little more about those types of activities. And we're really open to any type of creative activities that you want to hold in your communities. Thank you.
Yeah, and Almi posts the question, always a big question, how to reach people who might need the info. And as Leo has already mentioned, that is made much more difficult right now when we're closing off the physical space that might be available to folks who are challenged with housing as well. And Sue has a question for Kevin. How many items can your temporary card holders take out at once? And I guess I would add to that, do they have the same privileges that your regular folks do? I assume they do.
Yeah, so the temporary card holders can check out up to 3 items at a time. There are any items in the collection. They're not limited to a certain section. And we kind of look at it as a bridge to full library membership, because if someone's going to be in the community for longer than a couple months, we would issue them a regular card. So really, this is, I think, a way to, if someone calls, we want to make sure they know we can provide them services immediately. But it's limited to 3 items because, well, 2 reasons are what the trustees decided. One was the person isn't a resident of the community yet, a permanent resident, and 2, there's really no sort of recourse to get materials back. And so the trustees decided that was a reasonable limit for giving anybody access to the library. So basically 3 items at a time, and there aren't other limitations. It's basically you can check out anything you would like. So
that's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Joy has a good question. May they access electronic resources?
Yes, they can use the electronic resources. We haven't looked into the details of the end user licensing agreement at all. We just said yes. They are not, they're not part of the larger, they're not home card members, because the home card agreement does require a residency, in a permanent residency. So they can't use another library like some of our, like a permanent card could. But again, if someone is planning to be in town for longer than a short period of time, we would go ahead and issue them a regular card at that point. So.
And Kevin, can you just explain home card for those who are not familiar with that?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So Home Card is one of 3 different regional consortium here in Vermont where you can borrow material at a number of different libraries. So we have Home Card in the Chittenden and Addison County area. There's also One Card that kind of runs up the river, the valley, and then there's Catamount as well. So these are 3 different resource sharing consortia where you can basically go to any library in the consortium and borrow material as if you were a patron there.
Yeah, that's great, and unfortunately not available everywhere in Vermont. And Almi says another option for cards, if someone can't show address now but says they will soon, a regular card but with a 2-week expiration date. Also a great idea. And Jennifer asks Kevin, do you ask for contact info, perhaps a phone number, if not an address for the temp card? Sorry if you already said this.
Yes, so whatever contact info the person wants to provide us with, but they don't have to provide us with any, essentially. So as much as they're willing or able to provide.
Other questions, comments?
Can I jump in, Jeanette,
Yeah.
also, just to mention
Sure.
the plan for February, because I want to get it in folks who are attending today. We're planning on offering a couple more sessions, and one of them is going to be some hands-on sort of programs or projects or ideas that you could actually do. And so I would love for folks to think about, and then maybe get in touch with me or get in touch with Jeanette, some even if they're off the wall ideas for ways you could promote fair housing. But we'd plan on bringing this to a bunch of folks in a couple months, and we want to kind of get the collective brainstorming going. So I'd really encourage you to think about that.
Yep, that's really helpful. And it can be off the wall. I would also encourage you to think broadly across the ages. So, you know, we're going to work on a story walk that is housing related as well. So, just helping our youngest participants also learn about housing and how maybe being challenged with housing affects your life in a not depressing way, but just in an educational way. There are a lot of Jonathan has identified some animal books that talk about dens and things like that. So there's some really cute stuff out there that can help educate even really young kids. And Joy asks whether children and youth can get a temporary card.
Yes. Yep, absolutely.
That's wonderful, because I think there might still be some parents that don't endorse a kid having a library card, so this might be a really nice way to deal with that as well. And Joy is typing another thing. In the meantime, I put in the chat the link to the session on February 4th. And you can sign up there. And like Kevin said, that's going to be a little bit more hands-on. And kudos from Joy. She's excited that you're doing this for youth and kids as well. Okay. Other comments, questions, thoughts, ideas just off the top of your mind of things that you could do to participate? Any surprises in what you might have learned and how this goes beyond homelessness as well for a topic in libraries? And we have one caller as well, and you are welcome to unmute yourself and chime in as well, since the chat is not available to you. Yeah, Almi, connect with an anti-racism group in your town to create a discussion or program in April. And actually, that reminds me, Laura, if you wouldn't mind, if you have it at your fingertips, if you could post Susanna Davis's talk that she gave at the VLCT, I think, the conference about housing, and there was some really good information in there on redlining and challenges in terms of racism, anti-racism. So that was really helpful, and I highly recommend watching that talk that she gave. Susanna Davis is the director. If somebody can type her title in as well. She is our state equity officer as well, and is a powerful speaker. And that presentation is really worth watching and very eye-opening. And Jonathan just posted a resource list as well. Jonathan is our youth services librarian and is very tied into these issues as well. Executive Director of Racial Equity. Thank you, Kevin. Okay, and Joy posted as well. You're amazing, all of you out there. I also, Jonathan, I'm going to put you on the spot for a second. Could you put the link up for our DCF collaboration talk next week? Because it also covers a demographic that might be housing challenged as well, and that is foster children in the system. And I'll talk about that in 1 second, but we had some questions as well. So Jess, yeah. So Jess
yes,
asked,
I can do that.
Yeah.
I'll put
Okay,
it.
thank you.
Someone said they hadn't seen my face, so here I am.
Oh, there he is.
But yes,
Enjoy,
I'll put that
you
in
can show
chat.
yours as well. Okay. Jess has a question for you all, and that is, what types of questions do you get from patrons about housing? What types of housing related resources do you wish you had when you're right there at the desk and somebody asks you? So that's a good one. And Almi, yep, we have Jonathan's face. Okay. So does anybody want to chime in on the kinds of questions you're faced with in the moment? from your patrons as well, or challenges as well. Okay, while you're thinking about that, I will put a plug in to our presentation next week, and that is on the 16th, I think, Thursday at 1. We are co-presenting with another wonderful partner, and that is our colleagues with DCF, and we are talking to libraries about trauma-informed librarianship and also how to collaborate with them to help foster and kinship families as well. And there's a second session in that series. Oh no, there isn't. I'm sorry, I'm getting that confused. That is us working with them. So trauma-informed librarianship, especially with regard to fostering kinship families, is another topic that might be of interest to this group. So Ami says, haven't gotten housing questions at the desk. Too personal. Yes, and I really like Leo's idea of posting the information where it's readily available in case somebody does have a barrier to asking. So, okay, so I think I see Joy and, yep, Jonathan, thank you for posting that session, and Joy is posting as well. Yes, we have an evaluation, of course, and hope that you can fill that out for us. And I thank all of you, as we're wrapping this up a little early, for attending, and thank you so much for your interest also in this topic that affects so many of us who are just community members as well, in addition to librarians and public servants. So thank you. Be in touch with Kevin or myself if you have ideas for the February session, and hopefully we will see you all there. And please don't forget to fill out the evaluation, which Joy has posted in the chat. Okay, and Laura has just posted Susanna Davis's presentation, which is a YouTube video. So lots of good resources there as well. Okay. Thank you, and have a wonderful evening, and apologies for my dogs barking. It's dinner time.